Despite the loss to Alabama a couple weeks ago, Georgia's in as good a position as anybody in the country to go on and win the national championship. Talked about it in Final Feelings over on the website at dogpost.com. I went on a little bit of a rant, a little bit targeted at Georgia fans because morale's been down, right? You go from a lot of expectations heading into a year where Georgia's a championship contender and there's a lot going on, and they crushed Clemson and they beat Tennessee Tech, and then struggling at Kentucky, barely winning that game, losing to Alabama. All of a sudden the sky started falling in Athens. The sky started falling for Georgia fans. But look around the rest of the country, and I'll pull up the rankings and we'll talk about it. And I don't trust any team, really. I haven't seen a team that separated itself as a true championship contender. You can go through and pick apart Texas. You can go through and pick apart Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State, the undefeateds at the top. They have issues, and Georgia has its own issues. I've talked about them a lot. I will talk about them on this video here, and issues that I think would be a little discouraging if you see them in action against Mississippi State, right? Things that could happen against Mississippi State where you'd be a little bit concerned about how well Georgia's doing. But they're in as good a position as anybody. They've got just as good as infrastructure as anybody. They've got just as good a talent as pretty much anybody. The loss to Alabama happened. There are problems with this Georgia team. Problems, concerns, things that it can get better at is probably a better way to put it. But the panic button has been hit way too early. The Mike Bobo panic button is being hit way too early. There's still a lot of room for this Georgia team to grow. And I want to take you back to last season a little bit too when discussing, hey, it's too early to just freak out. Georgia obviously was a championship contender last season, didn't go on to do it, but the vibe in the first half of the season and the vibe in the second half of the season were completely different. The vibe in the first half of the season was, oh my God, Georgia's not as good as they were when they won back-to-back national championships. And the vibe in the second half was, whoa, three-peat, definitely, right? They crushed Ole Miss. They crushed Kentucky. They beat Georgia Tech. They are the number one team in the country heading into that game against Alabama in the SEC championship. So we'll talk about this season. Ryan Curley from Dawg Post talking about why it's way too early to be freaking out about Georgia. And I'm going to ask you this question. Who do you trust the most? Who do you trust the most? Whether you're a Georgia fan, a Notre Dame fan, a Florida Atlantic fan, whoever your allegiance is to, I have this one question. Which college football program do you trust the most in the end? Because I'll tell you right now, Texas has been beating up on some cupcake teams. I thought that they would play a little bit better against Mississippi State. I thought that it just would look a little sharper. Now, freshman quarterbacks out there. Ohio State has been beating up on some bad teams, has, messed around with Iowa in the first half. Kind of similar to that Georgia-Clemson game, right? Penn State struggles to score in big games, all right? And they haven't played a big game yet. So my jury's out on Penn State. Oregon hasn't played well to this point. Almost lost to Boise State. Danced around with Idaho. Georgia lost to Alabama, right? Another top 10 team. But an Alabama team whose defense is not that good, right? So I'm throwing Georgia into this. They're among the teams that have issues. Alabama just lost to Vanderbilt. Alabama now has culture questions, right? When you look at what a team captain does and how some of these players are acting, depending on if they win or lose. Tennessee just lost at the road to Arkansas, another team that was expected to go pretty far. Michigan has lost multiple games. Ole Miss has already lost a game. Georgia has just as good a chance as anybody else, even if it's not undefeated at this point. Texas. Georgia may win that game. Georgia may lose that game. But either way, the playoffs are still in question, right? If Georgia loses, it gets a little bit more complicated. Every game after that is a must-win. The season completely changes, and then we'll be having completely different conversations. But if Georgia beats Texas in a couple weeks, and obviously if they beat Mississippi State this week, I'm not overlooking this week. I just do think that Georgia will blow out Mississippi State. Then we're talking about, this. How does this team not make the SEC championship? How does this team not make the playoff? as long as they take care of business in the games they should, you're pretty much locking them into playoffs. So there's that aspect of it. When you think about the depth that these teams have, the transfer portal has gutted teams' depth, especially the elite teams at the top. And you're seeing the effects of that with Georgia. You're seeing the effects of that with Alabama. You're seeing it across the country. Depth, coaching, and momentum are going to be three huge things that determine who's going to be really, really good at the end. And when you look around at college football and you think, okay, who are teams that I trust to do that? Georgia's going to be one of them, right? They turned it on when they had to last year. They just lost against Alabama in the SEC championship, right? I think at this point, it's pretty well established that the end of last season was pretty ridiculous, the way that it went down in college football. But there's still time for Georgia to turn it on. We just haven't really seen it yet. That's kind of my thing. This is a defense that has allowed one touchdown in 4 games, and then obviously they let Alabama explode in the first half. But that was a very short period of time, and then Georgia shut them down. Georgia's defense has issues. It's not as good as it was in the past, but they're playing at an elite level for the most part, right? In terms of just not allowing teams to score. Well, hey, that's what helps you win football games, right? So let's not overcomplicate this thing. Auburn only scored 1 touchdown. Kentucky didn't score a touchdown. Tennessee Tech and Clemson didn't. So Georgia's doing its job for the most part. Offensively, they've had these games in the past. They've had the Kent State game in 22. They had the Samford game in 2022. Last year, a little bit dull against UT Martin and Ball State, right? Auburn was a struggle fest. South Carolina was a struggle fest. And then things got turned on. Georgia's missing some guys. Georgia will get guys back as the season goes on. This has been a theme for the Dogs over the last few years. They've just had important players go down either preseason or early in the season or even in the spring. Georgia will get healthier, and the team will look a little bit stronger. Georgia just beat Auburn without a lot of important pieces, without multiple on the offensive line, missing a linebacker. They're missing receivers, right? Robert Thomas was kicked off the team at the beginning of the year. Colby Young is suspended from the team right now. This is a team that's been going through a lot of issues and is still winning football games. So I think in terms of trust, you trust who is the consensus number 1 coach in college football and probably the number 1 staff in college football as well. I just think that it's too early. Now, yes, Georgia has another slow start against Mississippi State. They don't look good on offense. The defense allows a lot of rushing yards again, or all of a sudden the pass defense gets carved up by a non-elite quarterback and wide receiver duo. We're going to be having different conversations. If Georgia just lost to Mississippi State, we're going to be having different conversations. Then we'll be talking about, can Georgia make it to somewhere? I don't even know which bowl games they do anymore. The Liberty Bowl, is that still a thing, right? Then that's the type of conversation we're having. But right now, Georgia barely lost to an Alabama team when it played terribly. Georgia played terribly 2 weeks in a row. And they won 1 game and they lost the other game by 1 possession. So we haven't seen it out of Texas, Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State yet. So a couple of the contenders at the top. But you can't just sit there and tell me that after you look at everything that's happened in college football that it's just like, man, Ohio State's in a way better spot. Texas is in a way better spot. Record-wise, yes, but not necessarily positioned to win the whole thing. It's too early to be freaking out. That's been my large take about this for the entire time, is that it's just, we're not going to know. And these next 2 weeks of college football are going to be awesome. Oregon and Ohio State, Texas and Georgia, Alabama and Tennessee. We're going to get to see a lot of big-time schools clash, and we're going to see what some of these places are made of. Between Alabama and Tennessee, they both just lost. Well, which one of you is going to be a contender in the SEC moving forward? We're going to find that out a week from now, this week. Okay, is it Ohio State or Oregon that's going to take control of the Big Ten? I think it's going to be Ohio State, but what if Oregon does it? And then all of a sudden it's like, well, the preseason predictions were actually right about the Ducks. We don't know until we watch some of these games, and I just think people freak out and want to have a lasting opinion early in the season. It's too early for that. Thanks for watching.